Okay, so let's jump back into 2 Peter 2. We're working our way through verses 4 through 10a. We got through verse 4 last week about what I call the second rebellion, Genesis 6, the angels who sinned and were thrown into Tartarus. We talked about that and how Peter, like Jude, uses it as a type of judgment. So let's reread the passage, starting in verse 4, and then we're going to jump into verse 5, talk about the ancient world and the flood. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but sent them to hell, which is the Greek word for Tartarus there, the lowest portion of the underworld, putting them in chains of darkness to be held for judgment. If he did not spare the ancient world when he brought the flood on its ungodly people, but protected Noah, a preacher of righteousness, and 7 others, if he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah by burning them to ashes, and made them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly, and if he rescued Lot, a righteous man, who was distressed by the depraved conduct of the lawless, for that righteous man living among them day after day was tormented in his righteous soul by the lawless deeds he saw and heard. If all this is so, then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials and hold the unrighteous for punishment on the day of judgment. This is especially true of those who follow the corrupt desires of the flesh and despise authority. So if we can get through it today, as we're talking about this, we want to see if we can get through roughly this much while we talk about the salvation stuff along with it. So Peter's using 3 Old Testament examples as prophetic types that foretell the destruction of those who are going to reject Jesus' authority in this time that we're living in. So we got through the celestial rebellion, number 2, in verse 4. So we want to talk about the ancient world, and down here how he saves Noah, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and how he saves Lot. One thing that makes Peter unique is, although he's back to following Jude's outline through this, he actually does what Jude doesn't. He adds examples of salvation in the midst of God's judgment. He's using this if-then, and verse 4 all the way down through verse 8 follows the if. If God didn't spare the angels, if God judged Sodom and Gomorrah, if God rescued Noah and Lot, then God knows in verse 9 how to save the righteous while he judges the wicked. So this is the, and I use the literary terms, I forgot my head stuck on protasis, apodosis. I was like, no, apodosis is not the first one, but if then, it's what the law is constantly doing to give examples of if this happens, then this is the judgment that you render, to teach wisdom, not so much to explain specifics. Well, that's usually how it's read. So here, he's using these specifics to give the judgment ideas and the salvation ideas. If God knows how to do this, then he knows what he's doing. Trust him and obey him. So let's go to 5. If he didn't spare the ancient world, let's talk about the ancient world. So he starts to depart from Jude a little bit. He's still following Jude's outline, but Jude doesn't mention the flood. He doesn't mention Noah. Peter is in step with a lot of other Second Temple Jewish writers because Jude doesn't. Lots of people use the flood as an example of judgment. It's like the quintessential example of Old Testament judgment. 3rd Maccabees says, "You destroyed men from their wicked deeds in the past, among them giants, relying on their own strength and self-confidence, upon whom you brought immeasurable flood of water." So that takes us back to last week's conversation, where we talked about the angel shacking up with women and birthing the giants, which I don't think I mentioned this last week, but the word for giant in the Bible does not mean supernaturally tall. It just means abnormally tall people, humans that are big enough, clad in armor probably, and would just be really, really tough to beat in a hand-to-hand combat because they don't have guns to level the playing field. So that's really all a giant was. And so 3rd Maccabees follows the only picture of what the flood was about, destroying the kingdoms of the Nephilim giant clans. And 1st Enoch, as we talked about when we talked about Jude, is all about that. All of these early chapters in what's nicknamed the Book of the Giants is the celestial fathers, their giant children, humanity as a whole are judged. The celestial fathers are cast into Tartarus. The giants, the children, their societies that they built are all washed away in the flood. Even Peter, in his first epistle, links the flood to judgment and deliverance when he talks about God rescuing Noah. So he has a habit of using Noah. He has a habit of using Genesis. He seems like Genesis is one of his more favorite books that he meditates on. Genesis and Leviticus, actually. One might say if you really want to understand 1 Peter, you have to have a grasp of Leviticus. If you want to understand Leviticus, you're going to have a grasp on Genesis and Exodus. So again, as we talked about last week, when he says God did not spare the ancient world, that's language of saying he doesn't play favorites. Celestials was his example before. Now he's on the human. So he's balancing the ideas by saying, I've given you an example of God judging celestials. Here's an example of God judging humans. And they're linked, right? It's the same judgment accomplishing both. So his point is, God doesn't show favorites. He doesn't twist justice or anything with either branch of his creation family. And then I want to point this out because we kind of touched on this a little bit last week indirectly. The word world here, the ancient world, is not a geographical term. It doesn't apply to the planet. That's not how we think of it. It depicts humanity as a whole, not a planet. When I say as a whole, I mean the majority. It doesn't necessarily have to be exhaustive. It's saying God wiped out every single person because, as I mentioned last week, it says in Genesis 6, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterwards. And you have to determine, well, what does that mean? Did some people survive the flood, or were the celestials thrown into Tartarus well after the flood, and they birthed more children after Noah's sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth had more daughters? The Bible doesn't tell us, and so both of them are open to interpretation. I will say the Jewish interpretation that was dominant in Peter's day was that they were thrown into prison in Tartarus before the flood, before the 120 years that Genesis 6 mentions is over when Noah is building the ark. They were thrown in there, then the flood came later. But that's also not a strictly biblical text, so I don't care which one you pick. But it's going to determine how you read Genesis 6 through 9. Okay, so God didn't spare the ancient world, but he protects Noah and 7 others. Now, Noah's the reason the 7 others get protected here. Another word for protected is kept safe from doom. And the reason that's a bit of a stronger language is because it's the same word for the angels in the previous verse, kept in chains for judgment. So he's making very strong connections here. God kept the angels in judgment. They're still there. He kept Noah safe. His salvation and his judgment are two sides of the same coin. But you get whichever side you choose. If you provoke God into judgment, he will keep you for judgment. If you provoke God to righteousness, we might say, you get that too. So you can look up that word and its link in other places in the New Testament, specifically Jude 24, which is probably where Peter's using the term. It's God's ability to do something for his people, keep them safe in the midst of judgment. It derives in the Old Testament in the Exodus plagues, where after the 3rd plague, so 4th through 10th plague, the story actually says, but God didn't do the same judgments on the people of the Hebrews in Goshen. And it seems like God let one possibility is that God let the Israelites go through the first 3 plagues, and then he started making a distinction around the 3rd plague. Like, he's got to get Israel's attention as well. Ezekiel looks back at that and says they were worshiping idols when they were in Egypt. And so that might be one interpretation. But from the 4th plague through the 10th plague, God keeps Israel. God keeps Israel safe and protected in the wilderness. It's similar language. Later on, in the 3rd chapter, he's going to go on and tell the church that you need to be on guard against the heretics, lest you be swept away like them in this judgment. So the be on guard is to keep yourself in God's teachings. It's all kind of wordplay, Greek wordplay used over and over again. Now, Noah's called a preacher of righteousness in the NIV. Does anybody's translation say anything different than righteousness? No? From what I could find, most translations said righteousness, which is fine. Another translation could be justice, because justice and righteousness are the same word in both Hebrew and Greek. In fact, it's written here on my arm, the Hebrew, Zedek. This comes out of Deuteronomy 10. No, Deuteronomy 16, verse 10. And there you probably should translate it justice in keeping with what he's talking about. Well, here you can translate it either way. Nowhere else is Noah called a preacher of righteousness. Maybe justice fits better, but I wanted to talk a little bit about why that might be. Because God declares judgment. He says, this world I'm going to undo it. I'm going to unleash cosmic chaos waters that I shoved in a box in Genesis 1. I'm going to unleash it again and flood this world and start over. I'm going to recreate it and destroy these kingdoms. Noah, start building. And what was Noah doing during that 120-ish years that he's building the ark before God unleashed it? Perhaps Noah was spending time proclaiming that God's justice was coming against the ancient world in the form of a flood. If that's the case, he's acting very prophetically. His assumption is that, hey, judgment's coming, you should probably repent. But only 7 people took him seriously, helped him in his work, and escaped the judgment. This isn't exactly a dominant picture in the Judaism of Peter's day, but it is a possible one. People talked about these stories. People had questions because the Bible doesn't tell us a lot of specifics. They're stories like First Enoch or Midrash, designed to give a lot more details and answer certain questions about how people were thinking. Linguistically, this is actually a perfectly possible interpretation. That Noah went around preaching justice. Hey, judgment's coming. Repent. Preaching righteousness sounds like a New Testament idea because of our emphasis on Paul, who probably meant righteousness much more than justice in a lot of his language. But that doesn't mean we should force the interpretation of Peter to mean the same thing as Paul. So he could have been going around and proclaiming that God's justice was coming. It wouldn't make a difference if it's righteousness or it's justice. It really doesn't change anything if he's going around preaching at all. I'm speculating here, but it's a strong case. That should be case, not cause. A strong case could be made as it fits the context of Peter's proclaiming justice from God on the world throughout this letter. Jesus is coming again. He's defending that idea. That's the Greek word parousia, coming. As he's defending that idea, he's basically saying, and justice is coming for those who defy him. So, in a way, if you understand that righteousness or justice is coming. For instance, Paul says in Romans 1:16, the righteousness of God, the wrath of God is being revealed for all the unrighteousness, injustice of the world is being poured out. Unrighteousness and injustice, righteousness and justice, these are all the same terms. If you twist justice, you're twisting righteousness. If you're not punishing the way that you should, you're twisting righteousness. There's an element of mercy there, but there's also an element of where you say, we're twisting justice so much that we don't think God's ever going to judge. We think we're going to get out of it. That's what these heretical apostates are saying. So Peter may be laying on the idea of saying God was just with the ancient world. He will be just with this world in the future. That is a distinct possibility. Not too many commentaries that I read about this really brought that out. I was kind of disappointed in some of the people that I read because they should, in my opinion, they should have known this and remarked on this. But
it wasn't that back in that Noah time period. It didn't really rain. right?
Uh,
No, I mean
something.
until the flood came, it didn't really rain.
Yeah.
But it was pretty arid.
Yeah.
So all those people that Noah was talking to probably, hey, this guy's wacko.
Sure.
Yeah.
And
kind of like they thought about Noah, or not Noah, Jonah, coming out of a fish. You wacko. Probably like Lot.
There's always an element that when you're preaching about things to come, you sound ridiculous to people, even believers a lot of the time.
Yeah. Even today.
Yeah, because part of the reasons why the idea that Jesus wasn't coming again to judge was hard to accept for these people was that they could not seem to imagine an imperial-wide judgment. And now that we think of today, where we know what the entire planet is, we know the size of the planet, we know pretty much every portion of the map over there. Hannah's going to be going down to that portion of the map on Tuesday. So, yes, but you can't outrun God's judgment. So that portion of the map will also be judged. Heads up there in case it comes while you're on vacation. Geographically, you can't outrun God's judgment. And that was a hard thing to mentally picture and visualize back then because of how big the Roman Empire was. The idea that a single God could judge the entire imperial-wide world was a bit ridiculous in their schemes. And now today, people thinking that God could judge the overall planet and do it is a hard thing to process. And
for different reasons.
For different reasons, right. but they lead to the same thing.
Absolutely.
If we can't picture it, we'll just deny that it doesn't. It isn't possible, and it isn't going to happen. Right. But that's what God does. Every action of God is miraculous by definition. God, nothing is possible until God first does it, and He always does the thing first. And then, if it's possible for other people, celestial or human, to do it afterwards, then we follow God and we do things after Him. It seems impossible for God to raise the dead. Boom. Jesus is raised from the dead, right? It's a hard thing to understand, but God can do those things. And then afterwards, sometimes it's possible that the rest of us can repeat those things.
I'm counting on it.
Right? So, last thing on this preacher of righteousness, preacher of justice. The age to come is marked with righteousness and justice, which is what Peter says in 3:13. It should, therefore, be a quality that marks churches here in the present age. If that's the way things are going to be at that future time, how do you think we should live and act now? That's living in the already not yet. That's living in the eschatological thinking of the New Testament authors. So if God is going to establish justice and righteousness is going to be the core value of our lives, in imitation of our God who is righteous, live that way now. Be a preacher of righteousness. But don't just preach it, as James would say, do what it says, which is the more difficult part. So justice comes on all the ungodly, everyone who doesn't show due reverence to God through obedience to His kingly will. Jews and Greeks were in a complete agreement about that. Any and all gods were worthy of obedient recognition by lowly humans. But a high god of any pantheon, Zeus, Jupiter, and the Roman ones, whatever the high god is, for the New Testament authors to come along and say the high god is the Jewish God and He's lifted up His Son to have equal authority with them, it would be scandalous for anybody to say, we don't really have to obey that God. And it once again, just like he has in previous sections, tried to point out the scandalous nature of not listening to God, which is exactly what the heretical apostates are doing, leading people astray. There's a communal social agreement between Jews and Greeks that this should be done, and yet the heretical apostates are the ones breaking that social agreement towards the gods, or God here in New Testament ideas. They have no reverent obedience. It's scandalous, and That's exactly what Peter's trying to point out. And these people need to be warned. As God judged the people of the past who had such an attitude that they were not going to listen to the Most High God, He will judge anybody in the present, anybody in the future, who also has a lack of reverence for God, a lack of righteousness, a lack of justice, whatever specific term you use, or however specifically you use it. If you defy God, there's only negative consequences to come. The righteous who don't defy God need to be encouraged that their way of life will result in a vastly different outcome when this judgment falls, which is what verse 5, his protection, keeping of Noah and 7 others, is fundamentally about. We who believe and obey can take comfort in the fact that God judges the wicked, but in the midst of judgment goes and saves the righteous. Now, I think Noah is also an example in the fact that when God judges the wicked, and Lot will be the same way, you might still lose everything material in this life. If God judges the wicked, He may sweep away all your stuff, but you get to live. And which means you get to rebuild, you get to remake things again, which is what Noah has to do. And it's better than the example of Sodom and Gomorrah, who they're gone. You still can't live in the land to this day. It's too sulfurous in its content to live in this land. Verse 6 says, if He condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah by burning them to ashes, He returns to Jude as his source. Jude 7 says, in a similar way, Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding towns gave themselves up to sexual immorality and perversion. They serve as examples of those who suffer the punishment of eternal fire. Now, the difference between how Jude and Peter are using this is that for Jude, he highlights the city's sexual immorality and perversion. Peter doesn't care about the specific sins that Sodom and Gomorrah were judged for. Peter doesn't go into detail about why Sodom and Gomorrah were judged. His only interest lies in the fact that God judged them, and they're an example of past sins as a type of judgment for the future. So he does the same thing with it that Jude does, but Jude will go into more specifics of why God judged them. Just as he went into more specifics about Balaam, the Exodus generation, because they turned to idols and stuff. So Jude, as an author, was more interested in that than Peter is here. Part of what makes Sodom and Gomorrah archetypes for destruction, archetypes is another word for types, destruction of sinners in the Old Testament, is the fact that they were the first people to be destroyed by fire. So we have another connection point. Peter uses a watery flood destruction, and now he turns to fire, because he's getting into the eternal fiery aspects of hell throughout his letter. So,
would it also include the way the world this physical world will end before the coming of the New Jerusalem is by fire?
Yes, I think so. Well,
you could tie those all together.
Yes. I think that imagery can be tied all together. Yes, God says after the flood, I'll never again flood this creation. And so the portrait of the cataclysmic judgment of the destruction of the world in the future, the primary picture of it is being destroyed by fire, not water. So it's not a literal picture. Some people read it too literally, and they read Peter's language in chapter 3 as having to do with atomic weaponry, which is stupid, but we'll get to that when we get there.
But fire then leads into hell, like a fire.
Yes, it helps them connect a lot of points. It's also purifying in a good sense. Yes. So but it starts here, because Sodom and Gomorrah are the first to be judged by fire. So they work as an archetype of that. Fire as a means of divine judgment starts taking shape from their example. They get brought up in Deuteronomy 29, Isaiah 34, Ezekiel 38, Amos 1. Not all of these are talking about Sodom and Gomorrah, but they derived their judgment language, especially in the prophets coming in the future, based on the picture of Sodom and Gomorrah. And again, just like we've mentioned in Jude, this would have been really impactful to Jews who could go to these places and see the place where Sodom and Gomorrah were almost 2,000 years ago by this point, and how God wiped them off the face of the earth, and you still can't live there at the day. So it was a very emphatic picture for a lot of different reasons. Later cities' destructions are given a similar flavor after the fact. So the walls come down in Jericho, but after they've conquered the city, they burn the city of Jericho. So the walls falling is one aspect of it, but they burn it and they describe it in Joshua 6 like Sodom and Gomorrah. The same thing happened in Judges 20, where Gibeah is burned after they trick the Benjaminites to come out of the city. They attack the city, they burn it, and they speak of the judgment of these places in fiery terms. So their imagery of fire and judgment is building as time goes on, starting with Sodom and Gomorrah. Green says about this, in each of these cities, and he's talking Jericho, Gibeah, Sodom and Gomorrah, fire becomes the instrument of judgment that destroys the inhabitants, although a small group escapes. A remnant is saved, a point stressed by Peter in verses 7 through 8. And he looks forward to final judgment in verse 9. So it helps. The flood and Sodom and Gomorrah are part of his pictures because, again, unlike Jude, he talks about who actually gets saved from judgment. We'll come to that in just a second. First, he made them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly. So Peter's primarily concerned with the past archetypal judgment and what it has to say about future judgment and against whom that judgment is coming. Anybody who refuses to honor God, which is how he labels the ungodly. That in Sodom and Gomorrah, perfect example of the ungodly, regardless of why they were destroyed, the specifics of their sin. Anybody who follows the examples of Sodom and Gomorrah can expect it to happen in the future. Now, he'll go on in a few verses and he'll talk about how the heretical apostates are sexually promiscuous. He could bring it up here, but for him, it's like an addition by subtraction. They probably would think Sodom and Gomorrah and think the sexual perversion anyway. They know the stories, they know the scriptures, even the Greeks, because Moses has been taught in their cities for generations, 300 or 400 years at this point, and so they probably fill it in so that, oftentimes storytellers or we're in Halloween, so really good horror stories won't show you the monster or they won't show you the attack directly, and they let your mind fill in the blanks. They show you just enough so that your mind will immediately fill it in. And that's often worse than seeing it, because our minds tend to go way beyond anything if we're not explicitly shown it.
Kind of like
So,
Hitchcock.
yeah, exactly.
Right.
Hitchcock was the quintessential master of doing this in a lot of different movies in a lot of different ways. I think Rear Window is probably the best example because he leaves it to his main character and the audience for like 75 minutes to determine what is actually going on over there on the other side of the window. Well, by not mentioning this, Peter is essentially doing the same thing, letting his audience fill it in so that when he comes back and he accuses the heretical apostates of being sexually perverse, he's got them making an association in their head so that would say, oh, I better stop doing that, right? Or is going to double down and say, well, I'm not going to stop doing that. Well, then you're going to get the judgment side of it. So that good writing works that way. Cinematic storytelling at its best does this. Doesn't show you too much and lets the mind fill in the examples as it goes. So it's an implied idea that if they wish to escape it, the ungodly in the coming judgment, they should turn from their sinful ungodliness now, while there's time. Peter follows a prophetic example of saying, I may not explicitly tell you to repent, but everything I'm telling you about judgment is designed to get you to do that. He does the same thing. He doesn't fill in the sins so much as of Sodom and Gomorrah, lets their minds make the sinful association, but he also lets their minds make the association of what they should do about it, a little more indirectly. Then he'll come along at the very end and he'll make it explicit. But he's giving them time, as a person would be reading this letter out. Just take a pause and just sit on it at the end of this section. Maybe break for a bathroom break or something, and then have everybody come back, having thought about it themselves. Then he'll give you the explicit ending. Now, in the midst of Sodom and Gomorrah's burning to ash, God rescued Lot, who's called a righteous man. Connection to Noah, who's called a preacher of righteousness. Lot, a righteous man. So, just as he did with the typological flood, he now gives an example of a righteous remnant saved through typological judgment of the cities. Now, the thing about Lot, what do you know about Lot? Before we look into this, who was Lot in Genesis?
He was a nephew.
Nephew of Abraham.
And got to choose first about where he lived and what he did. And,
right.
Uncle Abraham gave him a lot of riches, kind of set him up for success.
Yes.
Which it's a little hard to understand how he turned out so righteous, but maybe you'll explain that later. And then they're living in this city, which is wicked and becomes increasingly wicked. And then, get visited by some angels.
Okay.
Rescue them.
What happens after Lot and his daughters are saved from Sodom and Gomorrah? What's the very next thing to happen? Hannah, what was it? His wife looks back. What did you say?
His daughters tricked him.
Yes, okay, that's what I'm getting at here.
Afterwards,
this totally comes up.
Yeah.
So first off, the thing about that is it's after the rescue. Here's the thing. His two daughters and Lot think that they're the only people left on the earth.
Right.
They think everything is destroyed. And so they think, well, we have to carry on humanity. So they trick Lot 2 nights in a row to get drunk and impregnating them.
Right.
And that's the people of Moab through the incestuous relationship of Lot and his daughters. So when it comes to that part, and I wanted to bring that part up first, that doesn't come into play here because first off, that's after they've been rescued.
That's a whole different sin.
So you have to keep the timeline in play. You have to keep the mindset of them saying, we've never experienced anything like this. It rained down from heaven, right? From the skies above, destruction came and destroyed everything that you're used to knowing and looking at. They don't have a concept of how much land is really out there. So they kind of had a point in thinking that from their perspective, their limited human perspective. Should they maybe have taken a couple of days and cooled off? Yes. But I would ask you not to judge them too harshly, because if we were suddenly living in a post-apocalyptic America, like so many of the movies out there portray it as, you might come to the same realization, you might make hasty decisions yourself, right? That's just something that tends to happen. But none of that is a point of Lot being rescued or being called a righteous man. What is in play here is everything before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, but primarily Genesis 18, where Lot's not there, and then 19, where he comes into the story. That's the real background to Lot being rescued. And Peter assumes his audience is familiar with the account. He doesn't give much detail to the situation. But just to break it down, in 18, Abraham's sitting under the oak of Mamre, and he looks up and he sees travelers coming, 3 of them. So he gets up and he runs over to them. He says, stop in my place. Rest your feet. Let's eat. I'll give you some food. Don't worry about it. You can rest for a while, and when you're ready to go, you can go on your way. He offers the expected hospitality that anybody who's righteous is supposed to offer, right? And he goes above and beyond. They say, okay, sure, we'll stay. And he runs off and he tells Sarah, hey, make bread, kill the fattened calf. I don't remember if they ate meat at this meal or something, but we got guests. Let's prepare some food. I'll go entertain and host, make some food. We're going to feed these people and we're going to send them on their way. Turns out that person is God and the 2 angels that would end up going to Sodom and Gomorrah. So he eats a meal with God, as Moses and the elders in Exodus would eat a meal with God on Sinai. This happens a lot. This is the point. Having fellowship with God is the point. And he doesn't realize it when he starts it, and then God basically reveals it to, hey, I'm going to come back in a year. Sarah's going to have a son. She laughs about that, as Abraham had previously laughed about that. She's like, the boy's going to be named Isaac. Laughter. But for now, what I'm going to go do is go check out Sodom and Gomorrah, because the cry of their wickedness has come up before me. It's time for them to face judgment. And Abraham ends up haggling him down from 50 righteous people down to 10, right? And God goes away, the angels take off, and they go to Sodom. And there at Sodom, there's one person sitting at the gates of the city, looking for guests, looking for people to show hospitality to, and that's Lot. And he does what Abraham does in the previous chapter. He jumps up and he says, hey, come to my place tonight. Rest your feet. I'll feed you. You can rest tonight. When you wake up in the morning, you're free to go. This was the basic common hospitality. Lot's the only person in the city willing to offer that. He's a sojourner. He's not a citizen of Sodom. He lives there, right? But he's not a full legal citizen the way that we would describe it today. But he's the only one righteous enough to actually do for other people, guests and strangers, caring for their needs. Yes, that will come up next. But you see, the association begins there, that he does what righteous Abraham does. So the Genesis doesn't call Lot righteous. It does not call Lot righteous ever. Peter is one of the few people to actually call Lot a righteous man. And as much as you can say, well, he had incestuous relationships with his daughter's fault, by the way, he didn't initiate that. You say, but the story is saying it in such a way where he's associated with Abraham, right? He is as righteous as Abraham. And then later on, when the men of Sodom come along and they say, hey, bring them out, we want to abuse them sexually, he tries to do what is right. He said, they're under my roof of protection. So you can take my daughters, but you can't take my guests. Right. Now, we could talk all day about what that does and doesn't mean. I had one commentator who should know better that I read a few weeks ago about this, said, well, they wanted homosexual relationships. Lot should have offered himself up and not his daughters. Like, you're completely missing the social point here, and you're completely missing the fact that Lot is trying to divert them from committing the worst evil possible by saying, if you have to do it, let me at least offer you something that's not as bad as what you're trying to do. First off, you cannot have my guests. They're under my roof of protection. I brought them under. I cannot give them to you and bring them out. And Lot doesn't know that they're celestial beings. He doesn't know that they're angels. And so the angels come out, blind the men so they can't find the front door, and then pulls them out and says, you've got to go, you've got to run, do not turn back. That language there for do not turn back means do not try and come back to the city. It wasn't just that Lot's wife merely turned around. It's that she was on her way out and decided, you know what? I don't think maybe judgment's not going to fall. Maybe I'll be okay if I go back. And she started heading back into the city. And she got caught up in the same judgment as the city. Because when she had the opportunity to repent, she became an apostate in a very real sense. She went back to the thing that was going to cause her judgment when she was forewarned prophetically.
Because she thought she was giving up much more than she would ever gain.
Yes. And it was just a huge judgment, became the picture of fiery judgment. The flood and Lot are tied together in a few other places, primarily Luke 17, as examples of eschatological judgment. So not just here in the New Testament, but also throughout Second Temple Judaism. They're the prime archetypal people. And so they are used the most. Now, we already talked about this, so I'm going to skip this one. Lot's never explicitly called it, so righteous. So here we go. Both of these slides. I do want to read this. T.D. Alexander concludes, by caring for the needs of others, he resembles Abraham. And since Abraham is commended for his generosity, Lot is also therefore to be viewed in a favorable light. Lot's hospitality is a mark of his righteousness. He said this back in 1985 in the Journal of Biblical Literature. So there's a lot to criticize Lot about throughout these narratives, but a matter for his overall character is that Even though there's not 5 righteous people or 10 righteous people,
Right.
God sought to save the righteous. He understood what Abraham was asking for, because Abraham's really asking about Lot. He doesn't say it, but God gets it. Despite the fact that there wasn't the numerical amount of people God agreed to save the whole city, he still saved the righteous within the city. And even, let's assume that Lot's wife was righteous. Even when she decides to turn back, she decides to face judgment along with everyone else. And she is a picture of apostasy, like the heretical apostates themselves become. Peter doesn't explicitly mention that, but I think we can make that point.
But that helps me understand why Lot was considered righteous.
Good.
Because
Yeah.
he was practicing what he had watched Uncle Abraham do.
Yes, and that's the thing. Narratives, well-written narratives, will not explicitly tell you every detail. They'll give you the story, and you have to be able to read the story and pick up on, oh, right, in the previous chapter, this is exactly what the other guy did. So they're making an association here. What was Abraham like? That's what Lot is like, because they're doing the same things.
It would be helpful if those chapters were back to back, but
Chapters 18 and 19 are back to back. The middle part is Abraham haggling with it, and then as soon as Lot's story is over, it flashes back to the next day where Abraham gets up and goes and sees Lot. So he doesn't even know Lot's alive at that point. Anyways, okay. So Peter's concern in the present passage does not take him deep into the moral dilemma of Lot's story. His point is that in the time of divine judgment, God spared the righteous while executing his judgment on the wicked. There is a moral contrast between the righteous and the unrighteous, but Peter doesn't explore the ambiguities of the life of Lot, or to a lesser extent Noah, because after the flood, Noah gets drunk and has a few problems there that we'll talk about on Wednesday night after the new year. But anyways, nobody's ever 100% perfect, and that shouldn't be surprising. Yes. Now let's stop with here for today. A couple of points to make about Lot. So he rescued Lot, who was distressed by the depraved conduct of the lawless. He could be placing stress on Lot's culture that he's imbibing himself with. Distressed in the NIV could be translated oppressed, who was oppressed by the depraved conduct of the lawless. This participle could be taken psychologically about Lot's mental state, but within the context of Peter's idea, it makes a bit more sense to interpret it in its more common use of one person oppressing another. Because he's tapping into the story of saying, they came to his door, they were willing to abuse the people under his roof, and they were willing to do some terrible, brutal things to Lot and his family to get to those guys. Right. So I think perhaps he was distressed, might be who was oppressed by the depraved conduct. You can find the terminology elsewhere in Judaism. Verse 8 more likely puts emphasis on the mental state of Lot, surrounded by the wickedness day to day. But verse 7, I think, is emphasizing the oppression he faced at the wicked people of Sodom, which is, I think, important to point out, because the righteous are going to face suffering at the hands of the wicked in this life as well. And we should be mentally distressed about it. So the depraved conduct of the lawless here is likely a reference to how Lot was treated by the men of Sodom. It links back to verse 2, where the heretical apostates are leading many to follow their own depraved conduct. There is a linguistic connection there. So indirectly, Peter's connecting the heretical apostates to the men of Sodom. He's making a typological connection of saying, what they are, you guys are now. But again, he's doing it subtly so that their minds could hear these Greek terms and fill it out for themselves. He may be going so far as to suggest the heretical apostates are bold and aggressive, like the Sodomites, but I don't know that for sure. That's mere speculation. A few things he says in some other passages here made me think that's a stronger possibility than I previously did, but I don't know that for sure. Regardless, Peter's intentions, it is undeniable that lawless living very quickly descends into violence in a society, which is a very important part of the picture, because our society, which has so thoroughly embraced lawlessness and everybody doing what's right in their own eyes, to quote Judges in the last few chapters of that, is very quickly descending into violence more and more. The security protocols that we're trying to build and instigate are because our society is descending into violence more and more and more. That's the pattern, and then God wipes it out. When does God finally wipe it out? When people don't take care of the strangers and the orphans. That's part of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah.